Hi, welcome to another sew along. Today we're going to be making a fun summer dress because those summer days are going to be here before you know it. And the Children's Corner Lillian is now back in print on tissue as well as PDF. So that's what we're going to use today is the Lillian. And even if you have the original Lillian, you'll be just fine. Either one will work. But what I have is I've just printed off the PDF because that's just easier for me. And then I've chosen just a great summer print, lots of color in it. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a little overlay for the top of it. So sort of like a yoke or a collar, but you'll see. And so also, not only do I need my fabric and my lining, I chose some bright piping. And I just chose a ready-made piping, and a yard will be enough for no matter what size you're making. And then the overlay will be a white piqué. So it'll be a nice crisp white against all these bright colors. And then I also have some orange buttons too. So, so even if you have your own tissue, you will need to print off the PDF part that has the instructions on it. And because there's several charts on here for measurements, so you'll definitely need it. And so just print that off, that's really easy. And then what I want you to do, you're gonna need some tissue paper because you're gonna do just a little bit of tracing. And all you need to trace is the front of Lillian, and just trace down just past the armhole, and get that done. And we will be back and I'll show you how to draft that overlay for your Lillian. So I've got my Lillian traced, just the top and just down the side. I did about 3 inches. I won't need all of that. So I'm making a size 3. So I'm going to refer to our PDF charts, and we're going to be making some dots and then connecting the dots. So the first dot we're going to put is at the shoulder seam. So for the size 3, I'm going to measure over from the neck edge along the cutting line for the shoulder. I'm going to measure 1 5/8. And then I'm just going to put a dot there. But be sure and check your chart because any other size but a size 3 is going to be something different. And then the second step is you're going to be placing a dot on this center front, which is also the place on fold line. And so I'm going to measure down 3.5 inches for that and make another dot. And then the next thing I'm going to do is measure over from that dot. So adjacent from that dot, or perpendicular from the center front line, you are going to be placing another dot. And for me, that is 4 1/4 inches. No, it is not 4 1/4, it's 2 1/4. And I'm going to be placing another dot. Okay, so we've got 3 dots so far. Now we're going to be connecting those dots. So from the shoulder dot down to that dot we just put, I'm going to draw a line. And then from the center front where that dot is, where we measured down, I'm going to connect those 2 dots. So now you will have something that looks like this. If I put it behind this white paper, you can see. So now one last thing, and this is totally optional, but for the one I'm going to make today, for the Lillian I'm going to make today, I'm going to put a slit in the front, and it will just be a small slit, and it'll kind of open like a V. And so if you want to do that, then you're going to be measuring down again on this center front line, just not as far. So I'm going to be measuring down 2 1/4 inches for that, and making a dot. Now for the slit, you're going to need to move over at the neckline just a little bit. And so if you will just measure down, let's see, 1/4 inch, not down, but over. So on the neckline, measure over 1/4 inch and put another dot. And then connect those two dots. Okay, so if you're doing the slit, yours is going to look something like this. If you don't have this, if you don't want to do the slit, then you won't have this line right here. But what you will have is a great area for a monogram or an applique or an embroidery, or just leave it white and it will be just a nice bright contrast to your fabric. So now this is your new pattern piece. These lines we've just drawn are your new pattern piece. I'm just going to cut it off down here. And you will only need to cut one, and you're going to be cutting it on the fold. So whether you opted to do the slit or not, at this point doesn't matter, because you won't be cutting your overlay open until it's stitched to your Lillian. So it will just be, I'm just going to go ahead and cut one on fold. And I'm going to put my size. So I'm going to get my dress cut out, and again, that's just from your regular Lillian pattern pieces. No changes with the pattern itself. We're just adding another pattern piece to it. So you'll cut one overlay on the fold, so you'll have a full overlay fabric when you're done, and then cut out your Lillian dress and lining, and we'll be back to get started. Okay, I've got my Lillian cut out, and I have the piping stitched on the outer edge of the overlay. So what I've done is after stitching the piping on the overlay, now I'm pressing that seam allowance to the wrong side. And if you have trouble knowing exactly where to stop and pivot, put a dot at the 1/4 inch in at that corner, and that also gives you a place where you know that you need to clip. If you clip right at the corner, just the seam allowance of the piping, not the overlay, then you'll have a nice smooth corner. So I've got this all piped, and actually we're ready to sew this on the front of the Lillian. Also, notice I did mark my V, and although I marked it on the front, I can see it on the back, which is good because that's the side that'll be up when you're sewing. So if you have a marker that doesn't bleed like mine did, you might want to be sure that you can see your V from the wrong side of your fabric. So the next thing we're going to do is get the front of your Lillian. I think I'll press that crease right there first. Using this wool pressing mat, that crease just comes right out because that heat is coming from both the iron and the wool. So after you've got your overlay laid on the front of your dress, now you're going to use several pins because we're going to be stitching this in place, and you don't want your fabric to shift. And if you notice that your bright fabric is showing through your piqué. If you're using a white piqué, don't worry, we're going to take care of that in just a bit. So I'm going to keep pinning this, and then the next thing I'm going to do is stitch in the ditch. So let me just say this about stitching in the ditch. If you can't stay in the ditch, then just stay out of the ditch and top stitch right along the edge of the fabric rather than top stitching in the seam. And the reason I say that is, for one thing, it's a hard thing to do. And also, when you're working with a white fabric and then a piping that is a bright contrasting color, um, it's hard to know whether to use white thread or orange thread, because if you use orange thread and stay in the ditch, then great. But if you happen to get out of the ditch and onto the white piqué, you're going to see it. And if you use white thread and you stay in the ditch, that's great too. But if you happen to get on the piping, then you're going to see it. So what I'm going to do actually is, at my machine, I've usually moved my needle position over 2, and that varies with every machine, for my foot I use for piping, and that will just allow my needle to I'll only move it 1 now instead of 2 over, so that will allow my needle to be just outside the ditch on the white piqué, and you will hardly even notice it's there. So I'm going to keep pinning, and then I'm going to stitch my overlay on in place, and then we'll be ready for the next step. So now what I've done is I've started trimming away the fabric that's behind the overlay. So I've just reached in between the 2 fabrics and trim about 1/8 of an inch from your top stitching line. So I've trimmed this part away. Now, because my piping is still such a contrasting color, I'm going to go back and trim the piping seam allowance too, so that it matches the dress fabric. So if you can kind of press the seam allowance of the actual overlay for me, for the white piqué, if you can hold that out of the way while you trim, then you won't have any of that color shadowing through. And for when I trimmed this piece away, I used a little pair of blunt nose scissors, because it was hard to know exactly what I was cutting, and I only wanted to cut this fabric. So I feel like it's safer if you've got a pair of those. If not, just be real careful. So I'm going to trim the piping seam allowance now. So now you can see that you don't have any shadowing, and once the white lining of the dress gets behind here too, you won't even see that seam allowance. So I'm going to finish trimming that, but let me just go ahead and tell you what to do next. Go ahead and get your Lillian back and sew your shoulder seams. Oh wait, before you do that, at the shoulder where you've got your piping, if you'll just reach in and pull out about 1/4 of an inch of the cording, it'll just make that shoulder seam a little flatter. So do that on the other side too. Then do your shoulder seams, and do your shoulder seams of your lining, and then we'll be back for the next step. Now that I've got my shoulder seams done, I've placed the back edge of my Lillian and the back edge of the Lillian lining together. So if you've never done one of our patterns that has a wraparound facing, this is going to look a little different. So your lining and your fabric will not line up right now. Don't worry about that. This is the seam we're going to do right now. And you have 2 marks on your pattern. This is for the newer Lillian. One is a square and one is a dot. I can't always tell the difference between my dots and my squares, so I just put 2 lines, and I know that I need to stitch all the way down to the lowest line. So I did that, stitched all the way down. I pressed my lining seam allowance toward the lining. And then before we leave the back of the dress, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to clip at that higher mark. So you stitch to the lowest mark, but now you're just going to clip in, straight in to the seam, but just don't cut your stitching. And then once you do that, you're going to take the seam allowance that's left and press it to 1/4 of an inch to the wrong side of the dress fabric and the wrong side of the lining. This will make more sense when you're doing your hem at the very end of the Lillian construction. But just go ahead and do that for now. That way you'll have a crease there. Now what I want you to do is to match up your side edges and then just press that facing in place. And move on up to the shoulders and make sure they are lined up, and then press that lining or that facing in place. So making sure my shoulders are going to match up here, my armholes. And then I'll just continue pressing that last little bit of facing so that now at the neckline it looks like this. So get that done, and then we'll be back for the next step. So now the next step is to stitch the neckline. So we're going to flip this again so that we can match up shoulder seams around the neckline. If you're working from the original Louise, now is when you will be stitching up the back and then around the neck and back down the back. So you didn't have to do that back seam separately because the original pattern did not have the wraparound facing. So after you've matched the shoulder seams at the neckline, then go back and fill in with some more pins along that line. Okay, so one more place we need to pin on this neckline is if you are doing the slit, then go ahead and pin 2 or 3 times, depending on what size you're making, how long your slit is, to keep that fabric from shifting. So you're going to be sewing with this side up, the inside of the garment fabric, and you'll start at the back neck edge over here and go around. When you get to your line for your V, stop and lower your stitch length to 1.25. Then stitch down the V. When you get to the bottom, pivot and take 1 stitch over, pivot again, and go back up only stop a quarter of an inch from the top neck edge instead of going all the way. Then put your stitch length back on your normal setting and then continue around until you get back to the other back edge. And then before we turn that right side out, you can also stitch each armhole. And again, match the shoulder seams. Okay, so I need to pin the other armhole. But you can see what you're going to do. You're just going to stitch this armhole as well as the other one. And then before you turn everything right side out, you're going to need to do some trimming and clipping, both of your armholes and your neckline. And then also you're going to trim right down the center of your V all the way to the point. And don't clip any stitches, but sew all the way to the point, and then clip across the corners that forms at the top. Then you'll be ready to turn your garment right side out. So I'm going to get mine stitched and we'll be ready to do the next step. So I've got everything stitched, trimmed and clipped, and I've turned one side right side out, but let me show you, in case you've never done this before, to turn your back right side out, put your hand through the front where the shoulder seams are, and then you just grab a hold of some of this back fabric, and then you just start pulling. Okay, so you're going to need a point turner. You need it at the back just to get that point nice and sharp, and then you'll need it at the front where the V is. You need to press it. So you'll need to press both the neck edge and the armhole curves. Let me turn this around so you can see. That's got some blue marks to get out. But if you turn yours around and there's some puckering right at the tip of the V, it's probably because you didn't clip quite far enough. So you may have to, once you see that, you may have to flip it just enough to get back in there and cut a little bit closer. So now you know how to put on an overlay, you know how to draft your own, and now all you have left are the side seams and buttonholes. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I really look forward to seeing all your creations for the summer.